Welcome to today's session of the Energy Security and Net Zero Select Committee, where we are delighted to welcome Martin Lewis, the founder of the money saving expert, and not just founder, you're chairman,
founder and exec chair. Yes.
Thank you very much for clearing that up for me. And what we're going to do is hear from you about the scandal of back billing, which has been very much in the news recently, but I believe there's one or two other things you'd like to talk to us about, which are going to contribute not just to this standalone session, but also to our forthcoming inquiry into the cost of energy. So, Martin Lewis, you are very welcome. Tell us what you would like to talk to us about.
I'll hold back billing for the moment.
Certainly.
So if I look at my mailbag, which is extensive, by far the biggest issue on energy costs is standing charges, by a different scale of magnitude to everything else that we get in. There is, of course, enormous difficulty presented by the standing charges regime under the price cap, often for many low-income people who have low usage, for many older people who, for example, only have their gas heating on during the winter, don't have it on in the summer, but are still having to pay every day just for the facility of having gas, even though they don't use it. There's also the moral hazard of the standing charge, the fact that lower users are effectively disincentivized from cutting their bills because they can't get rid of the cost of the standing charge. Now, I've long campaigned on this. We've done lots of surveys and polling, and the vast majority of the public don't like the standing charge. We accept that the only thing you're going to be able to do within the current price cap regime is shift some of those fixed costs towards the variable cost, to the unit rate costs of energy, and I think that would be an acceptable mechanism. Now, we have long talked to government and to the regulator about this. The regulator, understandably, has been reticent to change the standing charge regime for the simple reason that there are many charities who rightly lobby on behalf of vulnerable high users through to disability or illness who would therefore be disadvantaged by lowering the standing charge and moving it to the unit rate. What we ultimately need to fix that is government support for those users so that the standing charge can be brought down for everybody else. We haven't had that government support, which is a problem, and therefore I am pleased to see the regulator come up with a dual price cap suggestion of standing charges, which is something that came from an original suggestion of my team and I, which would say you would have two price caps. The difficulty on that, though, is the price cap is a backstop. By definition, the price cap is supposed to be there for those people who won't switch, that they would automatically, by default, have what's called a fair tariff. A fair tariff is, of course, not a good tariff, but it is at least a fair tariff. If you have two, then a tariff that is by definition there for those people who do not take an action and don't switch doesn't work if you have two of them. So one of the things that we will be pushing the regulator to try and introduce, which I think companies are fight, is a defaulting to the cheapest tariff of the two, which could be done by looking at the past year's worth of bills. Now, you could do that for everybody, which would be my preference, but I have a political realism of the way that these things work. So at least you should be doing it for vulnerable customers. Because otherwise what we will have is we will drop the standing charge on one of the price caps. We will have many low-using vulnerable customers, because the two things tend to go together, especially low-using elderly vulnerable customers, but they will not take the no standing charge price cap because it takes an action. Therefore, the only way you can do it is by having a default mechanism. We're suggesting mechanisms of doing that with the regulator, but I think support of this committee that if we're going to have a dual price cap, it cannot just be left to a choice when the price cap is by definition put in to be a backstop tariff for those people who do not make a choice. It doesn't work. So I thought that would be a decent place to open. If I carry on to another, I've got two more of these points, if that's okay.
That's very helpful.
If you forgive me.
Thank you. Yeah. What we'll do is, no doubt you'll put in writing more detail around these points as well, Martin, and there'll be very good starts to the inquiry, but please proceed.
The second thing, and I think this does relate to back billing to an extent, is the problem with smart meters. Now, I am generally supportive of the concept of smart meters. I think the rollout of smart meters was an abomination. I think we've all spent far too much money, certainly on rolling out SMET1 meters that were not compatible if you moved. It was a terrible thing that's added cost to all of our energy bills and should not have happened, but it has happened. Where we are now, though, is the government, not the regulators, targeting of smart meters is wrong. We have, by our statistics, 20% of smart meters that don't work. The government statistics are 10%. The difference is the government counts a smart meter as not working if it does not feed back bills to the company. We count a smart meter as not working if the customer says, my smart meter doesn't work, which can include that your monitor isn't working, or that the billing is wrong, or that there's back billing. We include all those factors as well. Now, when you have many people who wanted a smart meter have a smart meter, if you want to encourage everybody else who hasn't got a smart meter, now all the low-hanging fruit have gone to get smart meters. Well, the problem is, if there are a lot of people out there saying, don't get a smart meter because mine doesn't work, you have a brand issue by word of mouth that is hitting people getting smart meters. And this comes down to the targeting. The government targets firms to install new smart meters. That is the target. We know of cases where they install new smart meters that they know won't work because there isn't a signal, because their target is to install new smart meters. The right form of targeting would be to target firms on the number of working smart meters, which would include therefore both installations, new ones that work, and making sure that the ones that don't work are fixed. Now, one of the problems you've got when you don't do that is all the people who have non-working smart meters can't get anyone to repair them because the companies are putting all their resources at installing new smart meters, not repairing the ones that don't work. This is a real case of poor government targeting that has an issue, a side effect within the way, the practical way the sector is working. The companies don't particularly support the way it works either. This isn't me versus the companies. I have written to the Secretary of State on this. I have had some warm feedback on this, but nothing has happened yet. And I think it would be important for the committee to look at, do we have the wrong targeting of incentives? Remember, firms are fined if they don't meet their installation targets. It's not installation that matters, it's working smart meters that we should be judging it on.
Thank you. We've heard similar evidence previously, so that's very helpful. Now, you said there was a link between this and back billing. Do you want to just briefly explain what that is?
The link between back billing is pretty simple. If you don't have a smart meter that's working and it's sending the wrong information and the data isn't going through, then you can find that you've got a back bill because they suddenly come back and catch up. But we don't know how big that issue is because the smart meters don't work.
Right. Thank you. And your third opening?
I think the final thing to say is I think there is a real problem with competitiveness in the energy market. If you forgive me going a bit navel-gazing, we in this country have defined our energy market under a competitive system. There are two ways to do it. Two ways to do energy, being very simple. You either regulate pricing and nationalise pricing, so there's just one set price that everybody pays, or you go for a competitive market. If you go for a competitive market, which is a system we've worked under since we privatised, that there is market competition, then you need price differentials and you need competitiveness. The biggest incentive to switch is saving money. Now, customer service also plays a role. That's why Octopus has been so successful recently. It's got very good customer service reputations. But the biggest incentive is saving money. The differentials at the moment between the price cap and the cheapest tariffs are still very small. They're still fractions of what they were before the energy crisis. There are a number of reasons for that. First of all, we have a far smaller market with almost oligopoly providers. There's only a small number of primarily former incumbent providers, all with large numbers of customers. Because of the way the rules work at the moment, they have to charge their existing customers the same as their new customers. Therefore, if you have a very large existing supply, you don't want to cut your prices too much because you'd have to allow your existing customers to, and you'd be self-cannibalising. So that works against competition in the marketplace. The lack of competition there, because we're so interlinked, we haven't got much innovation going on because we're still all just recovering from what went on before. Now, while Ofgem has a rule within this that it says it's got a ban on acquisition-only tariffs. That means that firms must offer all deals to existing customers as well as new customers. If I were here with you in normal times, I would be supporting that because we don't want a sort of a legacy issue of a lack of loyalty. These are not normal times. We have limited competition. We need to do everything we possibly can to kickstart competition. Energy firms don't particularly want that much competition. They don't need to acquire customers because they have them already. And we have a competitive market where 2/3 of people in our competitive market are on a regulated price under the price cap. The other third are not getting that big gain from being in the competitive market. You can either have a competitive market or you can have regulated pricing. We have the worst of both worlds in the middle right now, and we probably need to address that. I'll probably stop there.
Thank you. I would love to explore how you would define when the abnormal times ended, so we could move back to a ban on acquisition tariffs. But that's probably for another day, because that's quite a long.
Well, we already we have the ban on acquisition tariffs. We need to end it before we can bring it back.
Yeah, exactly. But because I have every sympathy with the what you said about normal times, we will concentrate now on back billing, and we have been told by a number of people that the rules on back billing are very clear, very simple, should be straightforward to follow. I believe you have a rather different take on this, and perhaps you could explain why you think they're not clear enough.
Look, I think the principles are certainly clear. You should not back bill more than 12 months as long as there hasn't been an unreasonable obstacle. Now, that is pretty plain. For me, where there is confusion is Ofgem doesn't describe when the back billing exemption is valid. So that unreasonable obstacle is principles-based regulation rather than examples-based regulation. And I think that pendulum needs to shift the other way. You know, has someone came to read their meter, they were not available at the time, so the meter reader went away, they then sent letters to that person says they didn't receive the letters. Has the company done enough? Has the company not done enough? The company will clearly say it's done enough, the consumer will clearly say it hasn't done enough. Where is the dividing line? I don't know, because all we have is there should not be an unreasonable obstacle. Now, we all know that the definition of reasonableness changes depending on who's looking at it and whose definition of reasonable is. So I think there's a lack of specificity in the definition of that. With that said, I think there are companies who clearly know there has not been an unreasonable obstacle who are still back billing. And I think we have a systemic problem of lack of enforcement over the back billing rules, over a flaccid energy ombudsman, which I think is a real problem. And one of the things that we have discovered when looking into this issue is we think there is a real issue of breach, that what energy firms are doing is they are saying if customers are in credit when we are back billing, so they know they're back billing, it is fine to take the credit when they're back billing because we're not asking them for money. That is not fine. It is not correct. Credit is still money. You shouldn't be taking it. But they are using that as their justification for back billing, and we have examples of that. So I think we first of all, and I don't think Ofgem's particularly got this wrong in a form of deliberation. So I'm not trying to slap Ofgem around on this, to be fair.
But do you think there are energy companies who are deliberately using the kind of ambiguity that you alluded to?
Deliberately, I would say negligently rather than deliberately, probably. I don't think there's a chief executive who has sat there and said, let's go back bill and get every penny we can. I think energy firm systems and billing systems, and certainly there are some who are worse than others. Scottish Power has always been particularly abominable. I hope it's improved over the last few years, but I know that I can say that here without any worry, so I will say it. Scottish Power has been particularly abominable of its billing over the years. And I think there is just a lack of care on how this works, and a lack of being really strict and saying you can't back bill. And you know, there are obvious and direct examples of them charging people on the bills. And the interesting thing about this is, I know you've heard evidence of 3,000 people complain to the Ombudsman. Well, I mean, first of all, that's trivial compared to the number of people who complain to the firm. But the number of people who complain to the firm are a subset of those people who know there's a back billing rule. So we are actually reliant on those who know there's a back billing rule to complain about back billing, not of what's actually happening. Now, in what is close to a public utility like energy, it is the energy companies who should be prescribing back billing, not the customers having to revolt over back billing. And if I take that, so you have the first problem, there are many people who are back billing who don't know that there is a back billing rule. Then there are those who complain to the companies, and as many companies do, and energy companies specifically, some of their staff are not well trained, or it's negligent, or it may be deliberate, but I have no proof of that. Those companies then use legalese to say, no, you do owe us the money. And many people, when they get the UDOs the money, they get worried, they get scared. I'm going to have bailiffs at my door, even if it's not been suggested. That's what they worry about, so they pay. Then you get those few people who actually are tooled up enough to know that they should go to the Energy Ombudsman, who can give them an independent adjudication. Then we get to the Energy Ombudsman, we get a ruling. Now, if I just do the Energy Ombudsman for a second, which is another one of the really big issues, the Energy Ombudsman, and this isn't about the organisation, I think their adjudications tend to be pretty decent. The Energy Ombudsman isn't really an ombudsman. The Energy Ombudsman is an appointed alternative dispute resolution process. Right? It is not an ombudsman. We don't have a protected term ombudsman in this country. We absolutely should do. There are ombudsmen out there who really aren't ombudsmen and should be allowed to call themselves ombudsman. We have a 2017 report on that. If any of you are interested, I can send it to you later. That's much wider than just the energy sector. So there is only one, in the consumer sector, really strong ombudsman, and that is the Financial Ombudsman Service, which is a statutory body. When you get a ruling from the Financial Ombudsman Service, first of all, almost all firms obey it. In the very few occasions that they don't, you can take them to court and you already have a ruling, so the court is just enforcing the Ombudsman ruling. That is not the same as far as I know, and it's been tough to get an answer, to be fair on this. What happens if you have an Energy Ombudsman ruling? First of all, the rate of companies complying with the Ombudsman ruling is not close to the Financial Ombudsman. I don't have the exact numbers, but I can tell you from the mailbag levels we get virtually no complaints about firms not upholding Financial Ombudsman ruling. We get a lot about them not upholding the Energy Ombudsman ruling. I don't have a statistical number though, so I'm afraid it's only anecdotal.
I'm going to move on.
Okay.
Ofgem are going to be giving some evidence a bit later. A couple of questions about your views. Do you support calls to reduce the back billing period to 6 months? Do you think that the Ofgem rules on back billing are fair on consumers at the moment? And is Ofgem doing enough to crack down on unfair and inaccurate billing?
We live in a modern digital age where we're trying to have smart meters installed that give you an instant reading of what is going on in your energy system. Why should a firm take over 6 months to give you a correct bill?
Yeah.
I can't see any reason for that. And so I absolutely would support reducing it to 6 months. I would also support mandating that companies, if they are billing you for a period that is over the back billing period, whether that be 6 months or it be 12 months, they must include in prominent print on any letter where they are doing that, there is a back billing rule. If you believe we are doing this, you have a right to forward it, so that the rule must be incorporated. So if they believe that it's for fair back billing over the 6 month period, then they should be quoting prominently the rule so that you know your rights if you want to argue that, rather than allow it. And that doesn't happen, rather than just allowing it to go through.
And
so
do you want to see more of a crackdown from Ofgem?
Yeah, well, I'd like to see two things. First of all, I think the rule needs to be more specific. I'd like to see, the biggest complaints we tend to get are through the grey areas of whether somebody has obstructed or not. And I would like to see more specific rules from Ofgem on that. So principles-based is fine, but with some specific examples and setting up some codification of what does count and what doesn't count as back billing. I absolutely think Ofgem, look, if you've got 3,000 cases at the Ombudsman, it's quite easy to do an analysis of what companies they are with to see which companies tend to have the major systemic faults, and then Ofgem should be investigating those companies. I mean, that's how Ombudsmen should always work. If you have upholds at the Ombudsman to a company on a specific issue that is manifestly disproportionate to other companies, then clearly there's a regulatory issue and a systemic issue in the way the company's behaving, and it should be cracked down on. Right,
and then final question from me. Has the amount of consumer switching that has gone on, maybe not so much in the last few years, but historically led to an increase in the amount of wrongful back billing?
Well, we've actually had relatively less switches in the past few years. I'll tell you why I think we're hearing more about back billing. Bills are bigger. So back bills are bigger. Okay. I actually think it's a function of, if you get a back bill for 150 quid, you spit and swear a bit and you pay it and you get on with it. If you get a back bill for £10,000, you try and fight it. And I think the reason for this raising its head higher isn't necessarily that we've seen a sea change in the numbers, because it's always been around, and actually regulation and companies behave better than they did a decade ago. It was absolutely appalling now. Then it's only just appalling now. And I would say that I think it's probably a function of the size of bills. So it's such a bigger part of people's finances than it used to be. People care about it more.
Right. Melanie on.
Thank you, and thank you for bearing with us while we all disappeared off. We appreciate your time. You did start to touch a little bit on consumers and the complaints process. Do you think it's straightforward enough for people to complain? And you touched on the fact that suppliers could print on their bills if you think that we have got it wrong, contact us this way. But is there anything else that they could do to be more proactive and aid consumers? And also do more internally to be proactive about rectifying their billing situations.
Not back billing in the first place would be the best thing. Clearly, I know, and I know that you know that. Improve clarity. Look, I teach my little girl's 12. When we do maths, I tell her to check things intuitively. Right? Okay, you've done the answer. Does the answer make sense? If you have somebody in a 3-bedroom home who's got a back bill for £11,000, you doesn't take a rocket scientist to say there's something's going up here. So I mean, and sometimes you just go, how has somebody allowed that to go through? Because clearly it's bonkers. Now it may just be it's a computer and a digitisation issue, but when the customer raises that complaint, what you tend to hear is somebody on the other side just argues the company line rather than going, well, that doesn't sound right. I'll get back to you in a day or so, because clearly I don't know what's going on here, but there's something wrong. I mean, if I were running a customer complaint team and I wanted to get it right, I would tell people if it intuitively feels wrong, then pull at a flag, say you'll take some time and you'll get back to them. And I don't think that happens with all firms, is how I will phrase it. And again, I still push on the fact you can't enforce the Ombudsman's decision in court. What you actually have to do, what tends to happen is when it's systemic, the Ombudsman goes to the regulator then tries to deal with the company, but that doesn't work for individual cases. So we have there's no backstop of enforcement here for the individual. You've got the Ombudsman, but it doesn't have a statutory backing, which is ridiculous for the Energy Ombudsman. It absolutely should be a statutory body that's enforced with full Ombudsman power that all companies have to comply to and is enforceable in court, but it isn't. So I think the whole pipeline has problems.
And do you think that energy companies have invested in their systems sufficiently to be able to identify early issues that are obviously erroneous, like a £11,000 bill for a 3-bedroom house?
I don't have enough knowledge to answer that question because I'm not funnily enough, very much not on the inside of that. I have a little bit of sympathy here that the number of energy retail firms that went bust and were then transferred into other suppliers, and often those small tin pot firms had absolutely no proper data entry, and so if it's those issues, I've got sympathy with the suppliers who became suppliers of last resort who took it over because they were crap, right, what was going on before, and we need to make sure that we have fit and proper person and customer service and database tests for anyone who's allowed to set up an energy firm in future, and the regulator is stronger on that now. But no, I still think some of our major suppliers, I've named one but there are others out there, I think some of our major suppliers have consistently been very poor on their billing for many years. They've had data issues when they've launched new systems, and I still don't hear great things. We get a lot of billing inquiries that are wrong. I mean, look, we're on the back billing that's obvious. The biggest billing complaints we get is direct debit levels. Yeah. You know, we have people who are in credit in March, and March is the point of the year where you should have the minimum credit in the direct debit cycle. It's like a sine wave, and this is the bottom of the sine wave right now. They're in credit in March by 3 or 4 months. The prices are going down and their direct debit is going up by 30%, and they're doing meter readings. And they say, why is that happening? And the answer I want to give is, I was going to say a rude word, is because the company is baloney in what it's doing. It's just wrong. And I don't understand why the systems are allowed to do that. And so that for me is probably an easier and clearer and more mainstream example of billing systems just not working properly. And that is right across the board.
And within that, are there safeguards for consumers? So if there was, under the current rules, legitimate back billing, and a consumer was faced with a significant bill, are there protections if they were struggling to pay? Or are they just at the mercy of the energy company?
There are vulnerable customer protections, and there are sort of semi-treating customer fairly protections that work. The difficulty with all of this is, I'm going to use language I probably shouldn't use, but it's the easy way to explain it. Your good middle class knows how to complain, can work the system person, can tend to find their way and navigate through these issues relatively well when they go and do their research and they read the different places out there. But that means that you have a group of information disenfranchised and often from educational disadvantage and poverty and vulnerable and mental health issues who don't work these systems particularly well and tend to be the worst victims. So do I think there are adequate safeguards in place? For me, yes. Right? Not just because I'm me, but if I were doing it without, if you know what I mean, if I were doing it as a private individual without doing that, I could work the system and I would manage to get myself through this, and I'd make a very formal back billing complaint and I would push it very hard and I'd probably get myself justified. But for many people out there, this is a public utility. People can't avoid using this. This isn't a discretionary choice. And I don't believe the safeguards are in place, and I don't believe that we're hearing anywhere near the number of people out there. The impact, two other things I'll just raise quickly. First of all, we tend to find we're hearing quite a lot of people get a back bill 11 months after. Yeah. So that the company's systems are doing the checks to make sure that they can still back bill. Well, I with another hat, I chair the Money and Mental Health Policy Institute. A large back bill just in time, even when it's legal, is a bill shock, is catastrophe, and can be very damaging for people who are on the breadline. So that isn't good in its own right. So moving it to 6 months would help. You'd still get a 5.5-month bill, but it wouldn't be as big. So I think the systems are not set up with the level of consumer care that a public utility should have, if I phrase that right.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Claire.
Thank you, Chair. Welcome, Martin. So we've talked a bit about the regulators, but how effectively are energy suppliers being held to account over breaches of the back billing rules, and do we need tougher penalties for repeat offenders?
Well, I would say you probably shouldn't have a licence if you're a repeat offender and you've been warned by the regulator. Why should you be allowed to have an energy licence if you're back billing people and causing them catastrophic finances? I mean, a year is a very long time to get your bills right. And if you've cocked up as a company, why are you asking the customer to pay for your cock up? People don't know they're being back billed. They're not expecting, they don't have the finances. Not everybody is able to pay for a back bill that they didn't know. And I don't think the system works well. So, look, I need to be straight. This isn't in the top 5 issues that we get, back billing. It is an issue and it's raised with us. It's not in the top 5 that we get on energy. I think it is an important issue. In terms of studying how the regulator operates, I tend to think the regulator, again, I think this is all pipeline issues. I just think how many are actually getting to the regulator in the first place makes it difficult for the regulator to look at it. But I hope by the fact that you're raising it here, the regulator is going to take a tougher line. And I think you'll probably hear from them when they do the next session that they're going to do exactly that, which I would support. But I'm not sure all companies take the impact they have on consumers with these back bills seriously enough. Not just the finances, but the mental health impact of when people get these big bills, the abject panic. Yeah, so I think this is a much bigger and more serious issue than just billing. It's a well-being issue.
So, leading on from that, we hear about threatening and bullying tactics being employed. Is enough being done to crack down on that? And if not, what would you go back to the question of taking away their licence?
Well, I mean, I think that's symptomatic of the entire debt collection industry rather than the energy industry, if I'm really honest with you. We have problems with the bailiff sector on the way the bailiff sector works. Most people who go to bailiff's house, well, the majority of those people tend to have mental health issues according to the data, and yet you have to declare if you're vulnerable. You could argue that there should be a presumption of vulnerability once you're in that particular position if you were to look at the statistics on it. I'm not saying we should do that. I'm saying philosophically, because there's a practical issue in doing that, but philosophically we're not far from doing that. And we've only had a couple of reports of bullying tactics, so I'm not sure that I can stand that up, although I know you have other evidence on that. But right across the board, there are issues with debt collection, whether it be energy firms, whether it be private credit, or whether it be the two worst out there, which are central government and local government debt collection, which are by far the worst, way worse than energy firms.
I think my next question you've probably already covered. You do think the energy ombudsman needs to be a proper ombudsman with teeth.
I think it needs to be a statutory ombudsman.
Statutory ombudsman. Are you concerned that energy suppliers may be deliberately using back billing as a strategy to recover financial losses rather than as a last resort?
It would just be supposition. I mean, I can do supposition, but it would be supposition. I don't talk to the bosses of energy companies. I see it only from the consumer's perspective. What I would suspect, if anything were happening, and it is only guesswork, there may be a question on the lightness of touch and how much, where the line is drawn and where you pursue a grey area. And again, I go back to a lot of the cases we have are grey areas. That's the difficulty. If someone says, and a lot of them are, I didn't get your letters, we sent you the letters, I didn't get the letters, we sent you the letters. That's where a lot of this is coming down. So I can actually understand that from an energy company's perspective, and I can equally understand it from a consumer's perspective. And then the regulator's guidance is unreasonable, I've forgotten the exact phrase, I'll just read it, unreasonable obstacle. So clearly, you end up, that's a judicial decision ultimately as whose fault it is. And I think we probably need to clear up those grey areas. And, if you're writing and someone hasn't replied, there needs to be a different form of communication. And there needs to be what is a minimum basis of communication attempt for it to count as an unreasonable obstacle. And we don't have any of that. And it's up to energy companies to decide at the moment. So I would say, if I probably bring that round to what I'm actually saying is, I'm not sure that there is a deliberation to breach the rules, but I suspect there's what I would consider to be a lax interpretation of the unreasonable obstacle rules because they're doing it from their own agenda, which is what, these companies are there to make money for their shareholders, not to keep people warm. We sold them to shareholders, that's their job, so they're probably doing what's right for them, but it's not necessarily right for the public, and therefore the way to protect that is to have tighter, firmer and more defined regulation.
Great. Well, Martin Lewis, thank you very much indeed for your time today. Thank you for waiting for us to troop around the voting lobbies so many times. Look forward to hearing more from you towards our energy costs inquiry, and thank you for starting that as you did earlier on in the session too. We will have a short suspension while we change witnesses. Order. Order, and welcome back to the Energy Security Net Zero Select Committee session on back billing, and welcome to our two witnesses from Ofgem. And I will ask you just briefly to introduce yourselves and your roles, please. Beth Martin, if you would like to go first.
Yes, hello, I'm Beth Martin. I'm the Director for Consumer Protection and Competition at Ofgem.
Tim Jarvis, Director General of Markets at Ofgem.
Thank you, and thank you also for your forbearance and given the lengthy delay that we've had because of votes. You've heard Martin Lewis, the money-saving expert, giving his opinion on back billing. I wonder what your response to what he said might be as a start point.
Perhaps I'll kick off. I mean, look, there's a lot there that I would agree with, to be honest. I think that what we do when we monitor the market is we look at complaints. We look at complaints by companies. We look at complaints to the Ombudsman. We also look at our survey data. And where we see patterns of behaviour, where suppliers are acting outside our rules, we will take action, and we will take enforcement action. I think what we have seen on back billing, at the moment, the evidence that we have, and we are still looking at the evidence, and we're still looking at the data we've had from suppliers, so I will caveat that, is not showing huge increases in the numbers of back billing. But I think Martin Lewis is right that, of course, the size of the bill that people are getting is significantly higher from a few years ago. And so when people are getting catch-up bills within the rules, say 6 months, 8 months of a bill, a few years ago that was perhaps sort of £100, £200, it can now be £800 to £1,000. So I think that is a significant issue. I think we are looking at the length of period for back bills, particularly for people with smart meters, because where the supplier is getting accurate and timely information through a smart meter, there is no reason that we can see, particularly for back billing, and that shouldn't be so much.
Considering 6 months instead of 12.
We're looking at reducing it from 12. We're looking at all options, to be honest, on that for smart meters. So I think that's again something that I would agree with. In terms of the comments on the Ombudsman, I think that's a matter for government. The government sets the rules for the Ombudsman. Look, I mean, I think what I would say on that is that our experience with the Ombudsman is that they do a decent job, and people go to the Ombudsman tend to get a good experience, I think, and the outcomes are generally good. But clearly, it's not a statutory Ombudsman in the same way that, for example, the Financial Ombudsman Service is. So there is potential for reform there.
You talked about enforcement action right at the start of your comments just now. What would you like to see differently there?
So I think for us on enforcement action on all the issues, and we've started a project looking at billing accuracy. I mean, our view is that the issue of back billing is a subset of a broader issue across some of the billing accuracy issues we're seeing. So what we've seen in the market over the last 12 months is a significant decrease in the number of complaints and an increase in the levels of customer satisfaction, and that is including amongst customers who are financially vulnerable and struggling with their bills. And look, we put a lot of effort over the last 12, 24 months into setting rules that will try and help customers who are vulnerable and who are struggling with their bills. But clearly, there are still issues around back billing, and that's why we want to look very closely at the data we've had from the suppliers, because while there might not be that many cases for those customers who are on the end of these bills, it is extremely distressing. And when I've talked to customers about this, you hear their stories, then it is really distressing. And it is not so much often the fact of the back bill, it's how those customers are treated when they then query it and they go to their supplier. And that is where the suppliers have got to do better. We have seen improvements in customer satisfaction, as I say, but we will keep pushing them to do better and to make sure people get a proper service.
Now, you said that you're working on the data at the moment. Does this mean you can't tell us how many energy customers were back billed?
So the data that we have had from the suppliers, just to put this in context, about 340 million bills going out a year to domestic households for 30 million households. We're seeing data from the suppliers suggesting back bills in the low thousands, consistent with what we're seeing at the Ombudsman. But as I say, we would want to check that. We're looking at that data.
Just so I've understood this correctly, when you say the figure in the low thousands is for those who for back billing against the rules.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
But look, we want to look at that.
And you think that's reasonably stable? That's not going up or down?
We're not seeing an increase, and if you look at the Ombudsman's figures as well, they're also not increasing year on year. They're roughly the same each year, and you would expect that to follow through. But I think there is more for us to do, I think, in looking at that data in more detail, and perhaps, Beth, you might want to say a little bit about what we're planning to do with that data and the work we're looking to do now.
Yeah, so one of the things that we want to do is put that data in the context of the press reports and some of the cases that have come to light to really test and challenge whether it's accurate. we're looking at working through with suppliers to really understand and interrogate the data. We want to do some dip sampling, so suppliers are telling us that they are issuing back bills within the exemptions. We want to actually get some specific cases and test those and really test whether they're applying the exemptions correctly. We also want to work with them. A number of suppliers have said in response to our recent queries that they are either doing full audits of all of their bills or that they themselves have identified improvements that they want to make either to their systems or their processes. So obviously what we want to do is follow up with suppliers on those, both to check whether that changes our sense of the scale of the issue, but also to make sure that those improvements are effective in addressing the problems.
Thanks. That's very helpful. I've got hopefully some quite short questions before I hand over to Vera Hobhouse. And are you able to say what the percentage of consumers who have been wrongly back billed but were informed of the error by their supplier and then automatically compensated? Would you have a figure for that?
So those low thousands of figures that Tim have quoted are the numbers that suppliers have given to us themselves about cases where they've wrongly back-billed, and they've said in all of those cases they are proactively
they're correcting. Okay, and are you able to give a breakdown of the main causes for back-billing, and within those causes the proportion that are the fault of the supplier rather than the customer?
Shall I pick that up? I mean, look, I think I'm afraid it won't be that quick an answer to this. There's probably three reasons, I think, why we see back bills. So the main one is if the supplier has not got an accurate and up-to-date meter reading. And that could be because they haven't been able to get access to the property, they haven't been able to get hold of the customer to get an accurate reading. Now, the onus is on the supplier to get an accurate reading. So they need to do all they can to contact the customer and to try and get an accurate meter reading. But clearly, if people have not got a smart meter and the supplier is having problems, then that will be one of the reasons. Change of tenancy and change of occupancy is the other big reason, where the supplier's been unable to understand when somebody has moved in and when they became eligible for the energy that's used. And the other one, which is entirely up to the supplier to get right, is when people have been given too low direct debits and then they've built up. And now that is something that the supplier has to take responsibility for.
And do you have a sense of the balance, the proportions of each of those?
I mean, not statistically, no. I mean, I think this generally, if you look at the cases that we've seen and the cases that have been in the press, they nearly always revolve around not having accurate meter readings and people moving property or moving into a new house.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And are you able to say how many of the back-billed customers are vulnerable, going to what Martin Lewis was saying, and indeed how many consumers may have been pushed into financial hardship due to back billing?
So again, it's quite difficult to put a figure on that, given that the numbers are very low of people getting back bills. I mean, we know there's 2.3 million people struggling with their energy bills and in some form of energy debt at the moment. So this is a major issue.
Is this something you're... Sorry.
If I might add to that, I think that vulnerable customers are a clear focus for what we want to pick up through the black billing project that Tim mentioned. So we will be looking to get data from suppliers on the number of customers who were back billed, who were vulnerable. We'll also be wanting to look at the impact of the totality of the billing journey that suppliers are going through on the impact on vulnerable customers.
Okay, and perhaps you can provide that information to us when
yes,
it's available. That would be very helpful. I'll move on to Vera Hobhouse now.
Thank you, and thank you for coming to give us your evidence. We have already heard that you say it's in the low thousands, the back billing. But of course the impact on those who are at the other end of being back billed is quite high, and therefore it is important that we raise all our questions. Why do you think that so many energy suppliers still issue back bills beyond the permitted timeframes? And you've also explaining that actually you're going to even reduce the times from 12 months to 6 months. Isn't that actually making it even worse? But why do you think suppliers do that? Particularly in the light of that, there are all sorts of reasons why people, you say, tendency change, why people are getting into that problem.
Do you want me to try to take this. So what suppliers are telling us is that their systems are all set up to proactively identify bills that go back over more than 12 months, and that they have manual quality assurance processes. So what that suggests is that where the failure is happening is in relation to that manual quality assurance check, or potentially in relation to the training of those staff, or the policies and the kind of that they're applying when they're doing that manual check.
But it's often actually the customers who have got the responsibility actually it seems there's an imbalance. It's the customers who pick up that a bill is not accurate, and why is there this imbalance? And then they have to even query when something has been billed incorrectly to them.
Yeah. So look, perhaps I'll pick up on that, and I think to go back to your first point, I mean, absolutely, in a sense, it's not about the numbers, it's about the experience of the people who have it. And, you know, it's of no comfort to someone who's had a back bill and been pursued by an energy company just to know that there's only a few thousand of them, and that it's still a distressing experience. And I mean, the main answer to the question about why are these bills being issued still is because, for the vast majority of cases, and I'm sure the energy suppliers will tell you this, that the system runs quite smoothly. When they don't get accurate meter readings over a prolonged period of time, from they're relying on estimated bills, and then they get an accurate reading that is very different from those estimated bills, that is when they will then apply to look to see how to ensure that they're billing within the rules and they're billing back for the right period, and that is where you get into these grey areas.
And given the number of faulty smart meters, do you believe that smart meters have reduced instances of wrongful back billing, or simply introduced new technical errors?
So I mean,
you accept what Martin Lewis said during his description of the extent of the problem with.
So the government's data suggests that there's around 10% of smart meters not working accurately.
That's a high number.
It is a high number. I agree.
20.
And I think what that doesn't include people, for example, when their in-home display doesn't work, for example. Now that shouldn't affect the information that is going back to the supplier, but there is no doubt that a non-working smart meter is a massive issue, and that's where I do agree with.
Can I just say, even if the display doesn't work, that is just a transparency issue. If I think this is what I've consumed, and the energy company records something entirely different, again, I mean, this is just not acceptable.
I absolutely agree, and look, which is why we have focused on working smart meters, and that's where I do agree with Martin that it's really important that we get these meters working and more meters working. So as I say, 90% are working, but that's still 10% that aren't. We have started compliance action with each of the 6 major suppliers on working smart meters to ensure that they're taking all the steps they can to make sure that meters are working and that we're getting more meters online that are working, because ultimately that is the answer to this question. If everybody had a working smart meter, there would not be a need to
are you going to accept or do you agree with his recommendation about how the targeting is carried out?
So the decision on the smart meter programme that is one for government. We obviously look to support the government and enforce against the rules. I definitely think there is a case for more emphasis on working smart meters, and we are trying to do that within the system as it is at the moment. And we're currently looking to consult on giving consumers more direct redress when their smart meter isn't working.
One last one. Do you think actually it's because of the smart meters, our companies can now back bill when otherwise in the past they would have written the bills off?
I don't think I do think that, actually. I think historically the problem with traditional meters is people sending in, suppliers relying on estimated readings, and then they finally get an accurate reading, and then they're wildly different. I think smart meters should reduce that. The challenge is getting more smart meters and more working smart meters.
Thank you. And Luke Murphy has some questions about enforcement and redress.
Just very briefly, just to follow up on the previous questions. Is the number of customers that suppliers are reporting on back billing, is it proportionate to their customer base? So is it broadly distributed? There isn't a particular repeat offender?
Yes, the cases that go to the Energy Ombudsman are broadly in line with market share. There are 1 or 2 outliers at either end of the spectrum, but broadly it's in line with market share.
And do you publish the figure? Are those
So it's Energy Ombudsman data rather than our own data. I don't think they publish the supplier breakdown.
is there a particular reason why they wouldn't do that? Wouldn't that be a useful thing to see?
It would be useful to see. You'd have to ask the Ombudsman themselves why they don't.
So in 2023, the energy suppliers paid around 78 million in redress payments and fines. Are you able to say how much of this was directly related to breaches of back billing rules?
So around 25 million of redress payments and fines have been related to billing and metering issues. What we tend to see is that back billings tend to be a sort of symptom of a broader problem. So if you look at some of the cases that we've heard about, for example, and some of the cases that have been highlighted by the work that Moneybox have done, for example, it's often not so much the bill, it's the treatment of the customer when they query the bill, that they're having to battle for months on end to get a resolution rather than being treated fairly. So we have a range of licence conditions that we will look at, including treating customers fairly to make sure they get a good treatment.
So, I mean, I guess I think the numbers you said were kind of almost self-reported. Do you think suppliers are being proactive enough? I mean, it sounds like not, in identifying back billing errors and offering consumers automatic compensation.
So we don't rely on self-reporting, just to be clear. So we monitor Ombudsman data, we look at suppliers' complaint data, we also look at, we run our own surveys on customer satisfaction, look at data, and we talk to consumer groups and charities and about what they're seeing and what they're hearing, and that's what we follow up on when we take our compliance action and potentially ultimately enforcement action. So look, we need to do some more work on the data that we've had from the suppliers. But look, if we see patterns of behaviour where we've seen consistent non-compliance with our rules, we will take enforcement action, and we have done so in the past.
Do you think there's a case for where someone has been incorrectly back billed, that a supplier for instance, should have to pay that back plus 100%?
So we have these rules for other things. So, for example, if you have a missed appointment, there's an automatic, what we call a
guaranteed standards of performance.
Thank you. Where customers get automatic compensation, for example, if they don't turn up. And we're looking at that for smart meters, for example. We're going to consult on this shortly about potential rules so that customers have automatic redress. So that's another way of incentivising the supplier, but also ensuring that the customer gets automatic compensation when they're not treated appropriately.
If I might build on what Tim's just said, we're actually looking to do a broader review of that system of automatic compensation, those guaranteed standards of performance, because we want to assess whether the financial level of that payment is sufficient to create the right incentive. It increased last year to £40 in line with inflation, but there's a question about whether that is driving the behaviour we want to see with suppliers. And as Tim has said, we also want to look at the scope of the application of that regime. And in addition to SMART, I think there's a case for looking at its application to billing practices.
Yeah. I mean, I guess my point was if it was commensurate with the size of the back bill, that would create quite a powerful incentive not to do it. In terms of instances of threatening and bullying behaviour, where there has been been made by energy suppliers when seeking payment for back bills, what actions have you been taken? What instances have you seen of that?
So I think it's important to say first up that threatening or bullying behaviour is never acceptable from suppliers. We'd like to see examples. We'd like to if the committee has examples, or if any of the other witnesses have examples, we'd like to see them so that we can look at them. As Martin Lewis says, we have a fundamental licence condition, which is around it's our standards of conduct, so suppliers have to treat customers fairly, honestly, and in a professional manner. That's a critical part of our licence condition. It applies to every single interaction that a supplier has with a customer, and we will take action on that if we need to. We certainly have cases over the past couple of years where we've seen failings in customer service against that standard, and we've taken action against suppliers for that.
Martin talked about the financial ombudsman, and admittedly it is his post bag, and the fact that he doesn't get complaints about in their market providers ignoring their rulings, but he regularly gets that with regard to the energy ombudsman. How can that be right, where it appears that suppliers are consistently ignoring, according to Martin, the rulings of the Energy Ombudsman?
So we engage with the Ombudsman in a couple of different ways. So we obviously get the overarching data from the Ombudsman, which tells us where there are patterns of complaint and the types of issues that are coming. And then we engage with them and they talk to us about how well they're seeing those cases and the remedies that they're applying being implemented. It's actually quite rare for the Ombudsman to come to us and identify a pattern of behaviour with a supplier not implementing remedies, although they have done that and we have taken action against suppliers where we see that as a pattern of behaviour. I think what Martin Lewis was talking about was the ability of an individual customer to be able to challenge in court where the supplier is not has not implemented those remedies. And as Tim said previously, we think that's an issue for the government to consider as part of its Ofgem review, where it's looking at the role of the Ombudsman.
So it doesn't sound like the Energy Ombudsman on the regular kind of refers those kind of cases to you where it's clear that...
So we don't know. We don't have a role in resolving individual disputes.
Sure. Do you think there's a case for a statutory Energy Ombudsman?
So, I mean, as I said earlier in my remarks, I mean, our experience of the Energy Ombudsman has been quite positive in terms of the outcomes for consumers, and I think the operation that they run. But Martin Lewis is right; it is different from from some of the other markets where they have a statutory ombudsman, and that is certainly something that the government might want to look at as part of the broader Ofgem review, I think.
The Minister has arrived just as you said that, so that's thank you.
Very well timed comment, Tim Jarvis. Polly Billington, please.
Thank you very much. I'm just interested in the example that Martin Lewis gave, where at the moment the energy company system doesn't give a flag 3-bedroom house with a 5,000 back bill. What kind of regulation do you have to enforce on them to make sure that their customer service does have some kind of system, so that they're not just going, well, it says 5,000 here, and then you end up in a situation which is unfair for the customer?
Shall I pick that bit? So they should have systems that do that. Is the short answer.
And how to enforce it if they're failing that?
So look, what we've looked at is, if you look at energy consumer satisfaction over the last 12 months, it's actually increased by around 30%, and complaints have come down by around 20% over the last 12 months. So I think the systems are getting better. Are they as good as they should be? Absolutely not, and we will continue to push for better performance by suppliers. But we expect suppliers to treat their customers fairly, and that means responding to those sorts of requests in a timely and efficient way and treating them fairly, and they should be flagging that. Now, what they're telling us is that their systems automatically weed out back bills, and then everything else comes in with a manual override, and the staff are trained. Now, clearly, that's not working in all the cases, because otherwise, we wouldn't be here. And so we will be pushing them to do more to make sure that they treat customers fairly and respond.
Can I follow up on that? What guidance or regulation do you have on the energy companies to ensure that they are not treating all customers the same, but factoring in risks around vulnerability?
Yeah, so that's those standards of conduct that I talked about, which require energy companies to treat customers fairly, also require energy companies to identify where a customer might have a particular set of vulnerabilities and to take that into account in every dealing that they have with that customer. So that is built into those foundational standards of conduct that we expect from suppliers.
But I think what was also interesting about what Martin said was that the people who are going through the system are, like I tend to say, like my dad. He's got plenty of time on his hands. Like spending quite a lot of time in front of the computer. And to make sure that he gets a fair deal. Not the people who really necessarily need it. So are you satisfied that the regulations and guidance that you've got to those energy companies are ensuring an equitable treatment of all customers, so that the process of complaint is reaching the people who really need it?
So shall I put that? So look, I think we put a lot of time and work over the last 2 years to particularly to focus on the rules on vulnerable consumers. We have seen improvements in that. So if you look in the survey data, that is getting better. It's not where it needs to be. We will always be pushing the suppliers to do more on this, I think, because ideally what you want is a system that people ultimately really don't need to engage with. They're getting accurate bills, they're getting them in a timely way, and they're getting treated well and fairly if they're struggling with their bills. And what we need to drive is increasing that performance and improving those customer satisfaction even more. But so we will always be looking at our rules on this, and we are looking at the rules on billing and trying to particularly focus on exactly that sort of issue that people, because most people haven't got the time and energy and wherewithal often to challenge some of the bills.
Their bills.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much indeed to Tim Jarvis and to Beth Martin from Ofgem, and I would encourage you to look out for the evidence that we publish that we're receiving. I think you'll see some comments, some examples of the kind of behaviours that you alluded to, and perhaps you'll look at those. We will take a short break while the panels change over. Thank you. Session suspended. Order. Order. Welcome back to the Energy Security Net Zero Select Committee, our third panel on back billing, followed by a session on the retrofit scandal that we've been hearing evidence on as well. Delighted to be joined by the Minister for Consumers at Desnes, Miatta Fahnbulleh, and your two colleagues. I will ask your colleagues to introduce themselves, starting on this side.
Thank you. My name's Jessica Skilbeck and I'm one of the directors for Net Zero Buildings.
I'm Jane Walker and I'm the Director for Energy Affordability and Consumers.
Well, thank you very much for all of you for joining us and for your patience as we all trip around the voting lobbies, some together, some not, on the committee. We've taken evidence this afternoon from Martin Lewis, and we've taken evidence, some of which you heard at the end there, from Ofgem, and heard of thousands of cases of back billing from both panels, and of a suggestion that they are higher profile now because bills are so much higher, and that there are significant concerns about vulnerable customers. Minister, perhaps you could give us your sense of how well Ofgem's back billing rules are being implied and the enforcement of them against suppliers who breach them.
Yeah, well, listen, what I would say is that the rules are very clear, and it's clear that with the exception of particular circumstances, suppliers cannot bill customers for energy that was consumed more than 12 months previously. There are clearly instances where that rule isn't playing out in the way that it's set out on paper. I think there are some grey areas where there is dispute around whether the exceptions are applying, and I think that's what we're seeing in some of the kind of cases that are coming through. What I would say is that we've been really robust with both suppliers through Energy UK and Ofgem. So I have met with them. The Secretary of State has written to Ofgem, being very, very clear that if the rules are breached, then we expect review and enforcement. And Ofgem at the moment are going through a process of reviewing to make sure there isn't a systemic problem. Now, we're in the process of that. Let's see what comes out of that. The early evidence is suggesting that this is still quite small scale, but to be honest, for those customers that it has an impact on, it doesn't matter whether it's small scale or not. And then the second thing for us is, making sure that there is enforcement action if it appears that there is a breach. And critically, we are interested in them also reviewing the rules themselves to make sure that there isn't so much grey area that you can have these instances where the customer thinks they shouldn't be back billed and the supplier thinks that they should.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you said that, because Martin Lewis said that he felt that perhaps the rules aren't so clear after all, and there are these grey areas between who is responsible for the problem arising, and that causes significant difficulty. But many energy suppliers continue to issue back bills after a 12-month period, in clear breach, as you said, of Ofgem's rules. Do you think Ofgem is fulfilling its statutory duty to protect consumers?
Well, listen, I think there are two things I'd say. The expectation that Ofgem has on this is very clear. The direction that's been given from government is also very clear. If we go on the basis of the evidence that we have to date, so for example, in the year up to September 24, the number of cases that went through the Energy Ombudsman of issues that relate to back billing was about 3,000, just over 3,000. So it's in that magnitude of scale versus, lots and millions of bills that go through the system. So I think from the perspective of Ofgem, they feel that they've got a grip on this. Our job is to make sure that the thing that I'm candidly worried about is that this is a bit of the canary in the coal mine. So what you start finding are these examples that go through the likes of Citizens Advice and through money saving that kind of alert you to a problem, which is why we've moved pretty quickly to ask the regulator to look at this and to make sure it's not happening. The response from industry, to be fair, so for example, if there appears to be an issue with back billing, it's escalated up to senior levels. Ofgem are reviewing it. They are in constant touch with Energy UK. I think the priority for me is to get a sense of whether there is a systemic problem rather than individual cases that will be dealt through the Ombudsman process. And if there is, to make sure that we are taking the action on suppliers if they are in systemic breach of this. There will always be those grey areas, and as I say, that's why we're asking for a review on the rules to make sure they are as clear as they should be. But the question for me is this systemic, or is this a small number of cases that, for the individuals that it matters to, is still problematic, but we should then be dealing through the Ombudsman process?
Well, thank you for that answer. You mentioned Citizens Advice. Now, they're saying that many consumers, not only are they not aware of their rights about back billing, but they find their bills difficult to understand. Do you think there's a case for reviewing and advocating simplifying of energy bills?
Absolutely. I think a lot of people find their energy bills...
What are you doing about it then, as the Minister for Consumers?
Absolutely. Look, there is energy bills, to be fair, there's been lots of work to try to make them simpler, but for your average consumer, they are still very complicated, not least because of the way that we structure tariffs. So we are thinking about ways in which we make energy bills more accessible and simpler for consumers and more transparent. And for me, the fundamental point is that people have to have a sense that bills are fair. And part of for example, the reason why we are doing the review of Ofgem at the moment is to give people a sense that, look, the system is on your side. And I think they don't always feel it's on their side. And then when you have bills that require PhD to sort of navigate through, it compounds that sense that the system isn't necessarily working on your side. And that's something that we have to absolutely correct.
Okay, and can we expect an announcement, and if so, when, on simplifying bills?
Well, look, we are doing a wider piece of work on consumer confidence in the system. So we're looking at a suite of things. My objective and the objective I've been set by my boss is to make sure that the energy system works for consumers, is accessible, it's fair, it's transparent, and that people feel like it's on their side. So there is a package of work that we are doing around consumer fairness and how we can put things in place from things like automatic compensation through to people's understanding of their rights in the system and the role of the regulator and the ombudsman, through to things like how we make it a far more transparent and accessible process, and that will come in due course.
Well, thank you. And will that include ensuring that consumers are better informed of their rights about back billing and that they have clear means for redress when they've been wrongly billed?
I mean, not just back billing, but across the piece. So, you know, I'll give you the example of the energy ombudsman. Now, that is something that's there and available to all consumers, but actually a lot of consumers don't know that they have that point of redress. And so one of the things that we're looking at through the review is actually how do we make the system far more accessible to consumers? For example, the period of time that you have to wait before you move on to the ombudsman, where the balance of responsibility is in terms of be entering into the redress system. Should it be the consumer that has to contact the ombudsman, or should there be an automatic referral? So all of those things we are looking at in the context of the Ofgem review, but the objective is very, very clear. We need to make this as simple for consumers as possible. They have to be able to navigate the system, and critically, we need to build confidence that the energy market, the energy system is working for consumers. That's not where we are at the moment. It's got better, and Ofgem no doubt quoted to you the satisfaction levels which are going up, but consumers still don't feel like the system works on their behalf and in their interest. And the package of things that we're trying to do is to try and redress that.
Are you considering moving to a statutory energy ombudsman?
So, you know, as part of the review, we're looking at all the options. The call for evidence closed at the end of February. There are many ideas that have come through that, including the question of a statutory ombudsman. We're going to look at it through the round. We are doing a root and branch review of both Ofgem and the ombudsman that's looking at everything from their mandate, their duty, their roles and their powers. So we will be looking at that and thinking about, look, what is the right balance that will achieve that simple objective, consumer confidence in a system that works on their side.
Thank you very much. I'll move on to Torkel Crichton.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister, for coming in. Jessica, Jane, thanks for coming in. Tim Jarvis, who we just heard from earlier, described a billing system where bills arrived on time, were readable, accurate, and paid on time. And we're a long, long way from that, because that canary in the coal mine that you described is 60,000 consumers complaining to Citizens Advice last year. It's 43% of consumers saying that they're dissatisfied with the service they get and they don't believe their bills. Whose fault is that?
Well, look, there is a systemic problem that stems from the fact that we have had problems in this sector, without a doubt. And therefore, you have the combination of the fact that things are not as perfect as things are a long way from, let me reframe that, they're a long way from being perfect. And then there is that sense of lack of confidence, and the lack of confidence that you are being treated fairly by the system then compounds that, because then consumers will assume the worst even when there are justifiable grounds for where we are. So there is a massive repair job. I certainly recognise that. I think the Ofgem, the regulator, recognises that, as does the industry and suppliers. So we absolutely need to get to the point where basic customer service, basic fair treatment is a standard and given. And every instance you have where that's not the case, I think it fundamentally knocks people's confidence in the system. Now, in the end, my view is that the route to that is to have a regulator that people genuinely feel is working on in their interests, is a consumer champion. And part of the reason why we are doing the review is to make sure that the regulator has the remit, the mandate and the powers in order to fulfill that function in a way that can rebuild trust amongst consumers. Like, that's the primary objective of it. And if we get it right, then we make sure that we have at the heart of our system a regulator that can do the job of getting the system to where I think everyone wants it to be.
Far from feeling that's fair, consumers say that they feel bullied and threatened when they make complaints. They told Radio 4's Moneybox that's how they felt. Do you think we're doing enough to stop energy suppliers carrying out that kind of behaviour? And if you talk about regulation, then regulator needs muscle, which means financial penalties. Do you think there should be financial penalties for suppliers who consistently backbill their consumers?
Look, I think there should be financial penalties let me start by saying there are clear expectations in the licence conditions. So what we expect for suppliers is there, it's written in black and white. If there are breaches of those, of course there should be financial penalties. And, last year Ofgem fined...
Stronger financial penalties? Because they pay 5.5 million already and it doesn't seem to change the behaviour.
Well, So I think when we think about the powers that are available to the regulator, the question is, what is the sanction that shifts behaviour in the instances where things aren't going right? But I also think that there are things like automatic compensation, which is one of the things that we're looking at through the review, to make sure that if things, because there are two parts of it, it's how you make sure that there are the right incentives in the system to ensure that customers are always treated fairly and right. But it's also making sure that from the perspective of the consumer, you don't really care if a supplier is being fined. What you do care about is that you are out of pocket or you feel aggrieved and you want an instant response to that. So alongside making sure the regulator has the powers in order to have the right level of sanction in the system to drive the behaviours you want, I think it's really important that actually when people are put out, there is redress, and they don't have to jump through lots of hoops in order to get that redress. So one of the things we are looking at is what does automatic compensation look like, and how do we make sure that we equip both the regulator but also thinking about the ombudsman with potentially the powers in order to put that within the system.
We heard from Martin Lewis that something like 1 in 5 smart meters simply don't work. Companies are incentivised to install them but not fix them, not repair them. And do you think any suppliers are doing enough to fix that problem? And what can we do to make sure that smart meters, which are meant to give us accurate billing, actually do their job?
Yeah, look, I think just to sort of put on record, if we get to the scale of coverage of smart meters that we have, it will do a massive job in terms of dealing with some of these problems, as well as helping us deliver better customer service and more tailored and targeted services to customers. So look, we are very, very clear that we need to drive up the rollout.
Sorry to interrupt, Minister, but Martin identified the problem, which was that they're incentivised to install them, to roll them out, sure, not to make sure they work.
Yeah, absolutely. So in about 90% of cases, smart meters are working absolutely fine, but there are 10% of cases where they aren't, and it's not good enough. And so we have been both very clear expectations to the suppliers, but also working with the DCC so that we solve that problem. We are looking at the balance of incentives at the moment for suppliers so that there is as much of an incentive to fix meters that aren't working as there is to install new ones. And then the final bit for me is, look, the most important thing from the perspective of a consumer is I just want to know I've got an accurate reading. And actually, even if it's not operating in smart mode, it will still be doing reading so that you can know how much energy you're using. There will be a tiny number of instances, we think about 0.7% or 0.6%, where we may not be able to get full coverage, and we're working with the DCC now to think about what alternatives might be, for example, using broadband technology. So there is no complacency, there is a problem. I mean, one smart meter that's not working and putting a consumer out is one too many. And so we are putting quite a lot of pressure on the system to get its act together so that we are doing both the job of trying to just get coverage up to 90, 100%, which we're committed to, but critically where it's not working, we absolutely need to go in and make sure that we're fixing it.
Can I assume from that you agree with Martin Lewis's suggestion that the targets for installers should be that the meters work, not that they've installed them?
I mean, yes, because that's what consumers want. So a meter that is installed and not working is no good to anyone. I mean, it allows you...
You'll make that change. That's great. Thank you.
That's one thing you would do to change their behaviour. Just finally, what other two things would you do to make sure that these reforms go through and that suppliers are forced to serve consumers?
Well, listen, I mean, look, I think there are three things. If we get the regulatory framework right, I think it will do a lot of that. And having clear powers of investigation and enforcement will do a lot of that. I think for me there is a question of the things that we do as government within the framework that we create and within reforms that we're driving through with the energy market that also has a role to play and I think is as important. And then finally, look, we've got to have a backstop for consumers. In the end, what do consumers care about? They care about the fact that their energy is affordable and they care about the fact that they get a reasonable service. That's not to ask too much. And we need to make sure that we're putting in the right policy framework to deliver those two things.
With a bit of muscle, I mean, Martin Lewis talked about a flaccid ombudsman, that it doesn't really kind of enforce. Is there a case to make it a statutory ombudsman? So
we are looking at all the options, and we're looking at different models of the ombudsman to think about how we strengthen it. And as I say, it goes from everything to the amount of time that people have to wait before they get into the redress process, through to where the burden of action is. Is it that you're waiting for the customer to have to go to apply to the ombudsman, or do you make it a bit more automatic? So the whole purpose of the review is to look at the entire landscape. The objective is very clear. We've got to get to a system that in the end builds consumer confidence, and where people don't feel that they're being fleeced by the system or they're being treated unfairly by the system. And that is still the feeling, I think, for a lot of people. It's got a lot better, I'll concede that, but there is definitely a dent of confidence and trust that we have to try and repair.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Minister.
Thanks very much. Melanie.
Thank you. When it comes to the energy retailers, I mean, this is their bread and butter. This is their job. If I went into a shop, I wouldn't be expected to be paying for 3 times the amount of the product that I was some months later when they said, oh, I'm so sorry that we didn't realise that that was the product that we gave you. I wouldn't expect it with my mobile phone bill or anything else where there is automatic billing. I mean, shouldn't they just be getting it right in the first place? And is there enough incentive for them to get it right in the first place? I was quite interested in the response to Torquil then about the issue on fines. Is it enough? Is that really enough? It doesn't seem to be making a difference. Is there a case to be made for giving the regulator more powers to remove licences from some of these retailers where they are repeat offenders for failing to do the very basics of their job?
Well, listen, the case for more powers is absolutely clear, and that's one of the things that we'll look at in the context of the review. I mean, look, I'm not here to defend energy suppliers, but I think it's really important that we put the issue of back billing in context. So yes, there are absolutely a number and a sizable number of them, but in the context of millions of bills that are issued, it is a small proportion. Now, for the consumers that are impacted, it's not small, and that's why I care about it, and that's why it matters. But in the end, we have a job of lifting up the standards and lifting up the customer service across the piece. And in the grand scale of the things that I think the regulator absolutely needs to be pushing suppliers on, the quantum here, I think, is small. I think it's targeted in particular areas, and we need to get underneath the skin of what that is and why it's happening. It is not systemic. We're not seeing thousands and thousands of this, and in part because there's been a lot of pressure on the system to solve this problem. There are very clear rules that were put in place in order to make sure the back billing was not something that was pervasive. As I say, it has now been escalated up to senior levels in order to make sure that this does not become a pervasive problem. And I give you the examples of, for example, when we had the crisis with prepayment meters, involuntary installation. That was systemic. That was massively problematic. I think there is a problem here. It's not on that scale. And so for me, of course, the regulator needs to get on top of this, but I think there is a wider set of things it needs to look at in terms of customer service and the experience that goes beyond back billing.
Thank you very much. Luke Murphy, please.
Thanks very much. Would the government consider a complete ban on back billing beyond 12 months to make the rules as clear as possible? Because at the moment, it doesn't seem right that a consumer has to have asked for an accurate bill in order to be exempt for back charges beyond 12 months.
Well, look, we definitely need to tighten the rules, and that's what we've asked Ofgem to look at. On paper, the rules are you don't back bill beyond 12 months, except where you have already issued a bill and there is debt that you're trying to recoup, and or the customer has acted unreasonably to allow you to bill accurately. So, for example, if you've asked for lots of meter readings, but they won't give you access into their home. So it is some very specific conditions. But within that, there are clearly grey areas, and that's what's playing out at the moment. So I do think we need to look at it again. So it is as clear as possible for the consumers that are impacted by this, as well as clear as possible for the suppliers. And that's one of the things that the Secretary of State asks Ofgem to look when he wrote to them.
Do you think there's a case for Citizens Advice's recommendation to shorten it to 6 months?
So again, the Secretary of State, when we wrote to Ofgem, particularly where there are smart meters and there is no excuse, has asked the regulator Ofgem to look at whether 6 months can be applied. So in the review, those are the two things that the regulator will be looking at.
And for the most vulnerable consumers, there's obviously, I mean, this is a wider issue beyond just back billing, and the case for a social tariff to protect them.
So look, there are two things I'd say. We absolutely need to get better at identifying vulnerable customers so that we can protect them across the piece. And it's everything from billing to the sort of priority service they'll get, through to, for example, when customers go into debt, one of the challenges that suppliers have is those who can't pay and those who won't pay. And at the moment, we don't have the data to target the people who can't pay. And part of the reason we are doing quite a lot of work across government at the moment is to get to that data. So we're working with DWP, we're working with the Department of Health in order to see whether we can target that vulnerable cohort better for a whole set of interventions. So that's both saying to suppliers, look, this is our protected group. So we treat them, I mean, you treat all customers well, but actually there will be extenuating circumstances. So when you're thinking about things like debt recovery, you bear that in mind for this group. So that's a bit of work that's going on. But look, on the question of a social tariff, what I would say is there is clearly a lot of people who cannot afford their energy bills are under huge amounts of pressure, and we know this. We are putting in short-term measures. So, for example, last winter we negotiated and agreed 500 million with suppliers in order to support people in that winter. We've got the Warm Homes discount. We're consulting on extending it to 2.7 million people so that 6 million people will be protected. We're working with Ofgem to accelerate their Help to Pay scheme, so debt support for people who accumulated debt over the course of the crisis and can't pay it. And, you know, our Warm Homes discount, the regulation comes to an end in 2026, so we are looking at a set of options to build on bill support. We recognise that, you know, as we make that sprint to clean power, which is a thing that we hope bears down on bills, we absolutely need to protect a cohort of people that, you know, with all the will in the world will not be able to afford their energy bills, and we're looking at the options to do that.
So I've spoken to a number of people in the industry, and I think they've said a number of things, but on this issue. But one has been that firstly they really welcome the government's action on data matching, and I think they've seen that as a really positive step that the government's taken. But secondly, they've also said they've gone through repeated winters under multiple governments where there was a cry just before Christmas to be like, help us out in terms of, and they've said, given that there's that date coming up in 2026, is there not the case for the government saying, right, there is a looming deadline in front of us, and by this date we will set out, not just consider options, but like by that date we will have a new, whether you call it a social tariff, a new form of a social tariff. But is there not a case for setting that target and that ambition and saying, and then working with industry saying, right, we've got the data matching and we're gonna launch a social tariff or whatever you want to call it in 2026?
Well, look, 2026 is the date the regulations come to an end. We will need a successor scheme. So we are working towards that. We're working with industry towards that. You know, one of the challenges I have is different. Everyone says social tariff, but they mean slightly different things by it. And our Warm Homes discount, our rebate is a form of a social tariff. So we are absolutely having that conversation of what is working with what we have, what isn't working, what do we need to build on to think about what succeeds it in 2026. So that's a clear deadline. We will have to lay new regs in order to extend bill support. So there is an opportunity to think about what comes next, and that's the work that we're trying to do with industry, with third sector, and across Whitehall.
So on the data matching thing, is there a concern that it might work against some government departments' objectives, like the Treasury, for example, where if you apply data matching across a whole number of benefits, or that suddenly it becomes much easier for everyone who is eligible to receive the benefit?
Well, look, I can't speak for Treasury colleagues. In the end, my view on this, and certainly the view that we have taken through our Warm Homes discount, is that if you're eligible, it's our job to make it as easy as possible for you to get support. And actually, the way that the Warm Homes discount worked and the change, which predated me was we went from by application to automatic. So we do data matching with DWP to identify a cohort, and they automatically get it. They get a letter telling them that they can get support. There'll be some edge cases where we will ask them to come back to us. But broadly, my view is if you're eligible, you should be getting this stuff. And our job is to try and make it as easy as possible.
I think this question's kind of been answered previously, but just sort of, do you believe that greater oversight is needed of energy billing to prevent suppliers from issuing unfair or inaccurate bills in the first place?
I mean, yes, look, in the end, the whole point of having a regulator is to make sure that we've got a basic quality customer service that all consumers can expect. And, you know, it has got better, but it's absolutely not where it needs to be, because if it was, we would have far more confidence in the system. So that's what our regulator is there for, and our job is to make sure that the mandate and the duties they have are crystal clear around this. One of the issues I think the regulator has is that government, I think it's sort of 200 duties we asked of them, 200 things that we have in our strategic statement, the opposite of strategic. And so, you know, I think there was a job for us to make sure that we have set the right framework for the regulator to operate in a way that will protect consumers, be a clear consumer champion, manage that with other things that we will ask of the regulator, but absolutely to deliver confidence in the system.
And now, as you mentioned Clean Power 2030, I'm going to ask a question about the levies on our electricity bills and the very high electricity bills we have, given the government's priority to move to electric heat in particular, but more widely. When might we expect an announcement on any rebalancing or otherwise of the levies on energy bills? We had an answer to it yesterday from your colleague Michael Shanks, but it's your responsibility. So
let's hope we don't give us different answers.
Very keen to hear if there is. We're going to hear something, even if you can't tell us exactly what it is.
Well, we will be. We're sort of committed to publishing our Warm Homes Plan in the spring, and in truth, at the heart of the plan is a question of how we get clean heat into ultimately millions of households. That is predicated on two things: the upfront cost of doing this being far more affordable than it is at the moment, and the running cost of it being far more affordable than it is at the moment. So we're looking at that question. Candidly, the challenge for government is, you know, the case for rebalancing is obvious if you want to move towards electrification and clean heat. We need to think about the distributional impacts of doing it. So a system-wide rebalancing for customers on gas, and I'm particularly worried about low-income customers, will be difficult. And so we want to try to make sure that we're providing enough protections and we're designing it in a way that doesn't disproportionately impact on households that we need to protect. So that's the work that's going on at the moment. It is difficult and it's complex. If it was easy, I think it would have been done before. But we absolutely understand that we need to grip this, because otherwise it is a barrier to us driving clean heat at the pace and scale that we want to, but we've got to do it in a way that is fair for everyone.
Okay, well, thank you for engaging with the question, and it will be part of the inquiry we go into in greater detail in the coming months. So I look forward to further commentary and analysis and decisions being announced on that point and many others. We're going to move on to the failure of the installation of insulation, which you made a statement on in January, where you suspended 39 businesses from installing new solid wall insulation under government schemes until they fund repair work. And the figures we have are that there are 65,000 external wall insulation and internal wall insulation measures fitted in around 65,000 households to the end of November 2024 under the two government schemes, Eco4 and GBIS. Can you confirm how many of those, presumably of those 65,000 households, have been impacted by substandard solid wall insulation?
So we don't have an accurate number now, and what I don't want to do is to give the committee a number whilst we're still trying to get a full sense of the scale of the problem. What I would say is, so we committed to doing a set of things. One was to contact all customers that we thought might be impacted. So 60,000 customers have been contacted via Ofgem to tell them they may potentially be impacted, and that we are putting a process of triage around them in order to identify whether there is a problem and to look to get the system to resolve it if there is a problem. The second thing we committed to was a programme of audits and site audits in order to get a full sense of the scale of the problem. That is still going through. I will be honest that it's moving a little bit slower than I would have liked, so we're applying quite a lot of pressure on Trustmark, the certification bodies, the system in order to speed that up. We hope we will have a better view of this back end of April. But from the data that we do have, it looks like it is a better picture than my sort of worst case scenario when we embarked on this. But we will sort of confirm numbers when I'm not giving you numbers that aren't completely corroborated. I think the second thing that is coming out from the audits that are going is that there is a significantly better picture coming out of capital schemes. So capital schemes, for example, are schemes that go via social housing providers and local authorities because there is an additional level of assurance. So that's our emerging picture. Once we have firm data that has been kind of corroborated and that I am confident in, we will absolutely write to the committee to update you.
Well, thank you for your answer. The government says that installers responsible for substandard work will be forced to fix it at no cost to households and will remain banned from installing new solid wall insulation on government schemes if they don't fulfil their obligations to put the poor installation right. What happens if they go bust or refuse to carry out the repair work? Who will take on responsibility and cover the costs?
So the system has a kind of backstop built into it, which is the guarantee system. And so in the instances where a supplier goes bust, so far that's not the sort of world we're in, but in the instances the guarantor will and should pick it up and they will commission installers to come and remediate the work. That's their expectation. It's a 25-year guarantee, and so we expect that to hold. And we are working with the guarantors at the moment to make sure that our expectation of them and the system's expectation of them is very clear.
Yeah, and then final one from me before I hand over to Polly Billington. One of the witnesses whose, I think it was his mum, had a terrible experience with solid wall insulation, expressed grave concern that the people who'd caused the problem in the first place would be the ones to come in and put it right. I mean, how do you square that circle? How do you think those responsible for the poor quality work can be trusted to repair the damage? And in addition, will the government be requiring a follow-up inspection to guarantee the high quality of repairs?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a fine balance because I also think that if you've done work that's not up to the standard that's required and that's set out in the sort of PAS standards and requirements, it's your responsibility to fix it. And so we've got to make sure that we're not letting people off the hook. The experience so far, and certainly the intel that we're getting, so for example, if I take the audits that were done originally by Trustmark, where we identified issues, installers have gone in and are repairing them and doing it pretty quickly. There is an incentive for them to want to do that because they're suspended and won't, if you like, be reinstated until they've proved that they are doing the repairs and they've done it up to a good standard and the customer's happy. So that is holding. Look, and I'm doing a lot of speaking to installers at the moment to try and understand what's going on, what's gone wrong, what's going right. And, the vast majority want to do the right thing. They want to do good quality work. And if there is a problem, they are very, very up for going and fixing it. We are going to get a minority that are not going to play by the rules and aren't going to do that, and we will have to make sure that Trustmark and the certification bodies are working in order to fix those instances, whether that is installers that choose, quite frankly, not to go and repair the work or choose to exit the market, and they will have to make sure they're working with the guarantor in order to make sure that those consumers aren't put out of pocket, which is my sort of priority.
Yeah, no, and that's an important answer for very many cases, but where you've got this particular concern around trusting people being in your house, I think that's a real worry, isn't it, for people? So perhaps you can pick that point up a bit further. I think trust is one of the issues, and I understand that regaining consumer trust more widely in installation schemes is part of the challenge that you face, but there is this specific problem for those who've been the victims of some of the most egregious examples.
Yeah, look, and absolutely. So the vast majority, the system should hold. There will be a minority where it's either been done by, and I don't, installers that perhaps shouldn't be installing, and there will be a tiny minority of cases where that is true, or whether there's been such a breach of trust that the consumer doesn't feel confident in that installer coming back in, and there, they will need to speak to their certification bodies, and ultimately the certification bodies will need to respond to make sure that consumer's work, the work is being done and the consumer isn't out of pocket. That's the expectation, and so there's a bit of a balance. What we're saying is if there are edge cases like that, we want to know, and we will sort of keep it under review. My main priority in this is we've got to get the system to deliver. If the system isn't delivering, and we are getting intel that work that should be done isn't doing, then we will have to respond to that. But so far, installers want to get the work done. The measures aren't so egregious that they can't come in and fix it relatively quickly, but there will absolutely be cases where that isn't the case, and we will need to think about how we respond to that, but we're keeping it very much in review.
Yes. Thank you very much. Polly Billington.
Thank you very much. I'd like to follow up on some of this. How confident are you that issues with government-funded retrofit are specific to solid wall insulation under Eco4 and GBIS schemes?
So at the moment, as pretty confident, in part because based on the data that we have so far, it does seem to be an issue with solid wall, and that's in part because of the complexity of the installations, and it targeted at Eco4 and GBIS, but we will absolutely keep it under review. So for example, we obviously were doing the audits of the capital schemes to make sure that it's not extending to that. And again, the story is positive there. But also, a lot of our certification bodies, when they're going to inspect people's homes, they're just doing a wider inspection just to make sure that there aren't wider problems. If you like, the complaints that are coming through the system suggest that it's targeted, but we won't know until, we're not taking it out of scope. We have to keep a watching brief to make sure that we have 100% confidence that it is isolated to those areas. But that's the sort of impression we have at the moment.
That's right, and generally the calls through to the Ofgem call centre are an important source of intelligence here, and the call levels have been lower than, again, the worst case scenario that we perhaps anticipated in January, where particular issues are identified, they can be triaged through the system quickly. So that's another sort of temperature check on what's actually going on and whether it is contained as our initial hypothesis.
I'm sure.
Holly, can I just jump in there? Sorry.
I've got a lot to ask on this. I'm sorry, Talkwell.
Just the Minister earlier talked about 60,000.
Sorry, can we go through firstly, can we go through the chair?
Okay, Polly, go ahead. Sorry, apologies.
And secondly, we haven't got much time.
Apologies,
Polly.
I'm afraid my view on that is that has been driven, the focus on solid wall insulation, by the news reports that has demonstrated that this is systemic failure. I know from my own casework that Eco4 is failing on a number of fronts, including a woman on disability benefits who was left without any heat or hot water for days after having had a boiler and radiators ostensibly installed by somebody under the Eco4 scheme. So I'm just wondering how confident you really can be that those issues, and I've also had an 84-year-old man in a one-bedroom flat in a converted Victorian house who ended up with a heating system which nobody was able to teach him to operate, right? So, and somebody else who wanted to be able to get clean energy system in a high rise and basically was fobbed off and then told that there was nothing that could be done, and that basically somebody had ticked the right boxes and their duty to her had been discharged. So there are wider systemic problems about the way that the Eco4 system works. On the issue of installation failure, which my case of the woman who has been, nobody's redressing it, nobody's fixing it. She fortunately has home insurance, so she's been looked after for 5 days outside of the house, but she can't live in her house. Nobody's coming back to sort it out. That feels to me like, forgive me to quote the government back at itself, a really egregious example of state failure.
Look, headline is the system of quality assurance that we have is not fit for purpose. And look, I don't think that is unique. We think we've got a particular systemic issue around Eco4 and GBIS and solid wall insulation, but there is a wider point that in the end, people going into people's homes to put installs and to upgrades, our system of quality assurance, our system of consumer protection is not fit for purpose. And I'm at the front of the queue shouting this. So is there a systemic structural problem we need to deal with? Absolutely. And that's why we've been very, very clear that we will have to think about a root and branch overhaul. And that goes from everything to who goes into your house and how do you have confidence that they are the right people to go into your house. It goes into how are we doing quality assurance of the work that's done. And there's short-term things that we're doing. I'll come on to that, but it needs a much, much bigger review through to our sort of quality mark system. Because in the end, like candidly, the thing I care about is we want to see hundreds of thousands, millions of home upgrades. And if people don't have confidence that when someone comes into their home to upgrade it, it will be of a particular quality, we won't deliver that outcome. And the system at the moment, if you were designing a system, this is not the system that you would design. It's far too complicated, it's ad hoc, and accountability and protection for consumers is far too weak. So we have to overhaul the whole thing. And I'm very clear about that. And that's what our sort of reforms will do. We are trying to do some things in the short term. So little things like the level of, trust mark is our core quality mark within that, the level of kind of engagement that we have, and we want to up in the short term. So, for example, we will have an observer on their board. We are now in constant contact with them. We are getting dashboards on progress. Things like, I was pretty shocked by this, but originally you didn't have to go on site to do a site audit to check quality. We've now updated the PAS guidance, which means that you have to have an on-site audit for complex schemes to make sure that we're doing some of that, and that comes in place straight away in March. Certification bodies who are supposed to oversee all of this. Before, if you're a supplier, you could be with multiple certification bodies, which meant that kind of oversight and quality assurance could potentially be gamed. I don't think it was often, but it could be gamed. And again, we've said one certification body. So there are short-term things that we are doing. But does the system need to be overhauled? Absolutely. Would you design it in this way? Absolutely not.
I'll come to that in a moment. The company that carried out the works, the certification bodies and Ofgem, so far, none of them have offered to remedy the works in that example. So it might not be systemic, but it is an extreme example of some of the failures. So I'd like to come on to what have you learned from schemes that do work that might help address some of the failures that we've got in Eco4 and GBIS?
And just on the example that you gave, look, we are trying to build a picture. So if there are examples where the system is failing, then please do feed those into...
Don't worry.
Very good. I don't need to ask.
What have you learned from schemes that do work?
Yeah, so listen, as I sort of said before, our capital schemes in particular, I think, are telling a much, much, much stronger story. We're still trying to get a full picture, so we have a big enough sample that I can say with full confidence, but at the moment, from what we're getting, it looks like night and day. And what do we know about those schemes? The first is there is a much stronger level of assurance through housing associations who are the commissioners. And instead of individual households, they're the commissioner or local authorities. And so they are putting in place additional checks in the system to make sure it's working better. I think the lines of accountability are much stronger. We've got delivery partners and agents that are playing a much stronger role. So Salix and some of our delivery partners that play a much stronger role in terms of quality assurance. The lesson I've taken from that is actually, if you have clear oversight and quality assurance and you have that intermediary, and quite frankly at the local level, that is delivering better quality schemes for people. And when things are going wrong, the response rate is much quicker without the burden being on the individual consumer and household.
Have you had any evidence presented to you by civil servants about the way that the Warmer Homes Scotland programme works, which has, for example, a single entry point for all the centrally managed schemes, in contrast to England, where the short-term funding on a local scale has been going for years? You know, it's had a significant rollout across a range of different kind of communities. You don't have a postcode lottery. Has the evidence been presented to you, and what has been done in light of that evidence, if you have received it?
So, I mean, I'll let Jess speak about the evidence more broadly. So I've spoken to the Scottish Government. We know that they are delivering it in a slightly different way. My three takeaways are area-based, I think, is an important ingredient here because you can deliver at scale and you can bring partners together. I think the second thing I'd say is you absolutely need that level of sort of commissioning oversight that can be provided by local government and social housing providers on the ground. And you absolutely need to do everything you can to make the journey very simple for consumers. So, for example, I think the kind of advice service that they have, a single advice service, just makes it easier for people to navigate. So we are absolutely learning the lessons from Scotland and elsewhere about what is working well as we think about how we design schemes through the Warm Homes Plan. But
I mean, just to echo what the Minister has said, we're in very regular communication with our colleagues in Scotland, looking to learn from them and potentially them from us as well. And particularly at the moment, sort of thinking about the Warm Homes Plan, the future of the capital programmes, the future of supplier obligations post-2026. It's a very important time, and we absolutely hear the messages of the importance of long-term certainty, simplicity, ease of access, a trade-off between complexity, often designed to reduce dead weight in schemes, but that leading to a very sort of difficult to navigate picture for the end consumer. So it absolutely looking to learn from their experience.
Thank you very much. We're going to have to move on because I know, Minister, you have to be away at 6. So Chris Chope, you have a next question.
I sympathise with you, Minister, because you are trying to champion consumer confidence and you've got some real problems. Obviously, one of the first you've got to overcome is the fact that consumers were promised that their bills would go down by £300 and you haven't got anywhere towards achieving that yet. Similarly, you've got to try and rebuild confidence in smart meters. And now I don't know whether you heard the evidence earlier, but it seems that it's not just 1 in 10, but 5 in every 100 that is not working properly. And that there's a much bigger problem for smart meters, as a result of which the word on the street is I wouldn't touch a smart meter. And so will you, in the interim, stop essentially forcing consumers into having smart meters imposed on them? Because a lot of consumers feel that the smart meter system is duping them into believing that it's all for their own convenience, so they'll be able to see how much energy they're using. Whereas actually we know that in reality it's all designed to enable Big Brother to keep an eye on when and how the energy is being used. And if the smart meters themselves don't work, and then create all the problems we've been hearing about earlier, then people lose confidence in them. So how are you going to be able to rebuild that confidence? And wouldn't one way be to introduce a guarantee, a government-funded, supported guarantee for that anybody who has a smart meter installed is going to be able to have that put right at quickly within a specified timescale, because that replicates what should have been happening in relation to these other government schemes. And as I understand it, even today there are 250,000 homes which are unmortgageable just because they've been subject to retrofitted spray foam. Now, what are we doing to help those people? They are completely under the cosh. And as I think has already been made clear, there's a feeling out there that Eco4 and the Great British Insulation Scheme, that those are still delivering bad results for people. So the confidence is plummeting, and despite your best efforts, I think it continues to plummet until such time as there's some firm guarantees that the people have already been done down by in various ways, so that they will get proper remedies and compensation, and that people who are seduced into adopting these government schemes for in their own homes, that they will have an assurance that they're not going to suffer the same fate as so many others. So that's my question.
I am finally going to intervene and stop you there, because we're here to hear from the witnesses, not from the members of the committee.
I'm sorry, Chairman, that's what happens if you've been waiting for 2 hours to ask a question.
I don't think it was a question, it was a statement. But I'll ask the Minister to reply, but I suggest for your next questions you're a lot shorter.
My next question would be much shorter, but perhaps the Minister would like to comment on that one.
Yes. So that was, I'll go through, I think there were 5 questions in that, so I'll take each of them in turn. So look, is the inheritance really tough? Absolutely. Is the confidence in the system not where it needs to be? Absolutely. That's the backdrop. And the job is to try and turn that around. I'm confident we can turn that around, but let me take each of those in turn. So bills going down. In the end, that is our primary objective of everything we're trying to do. And whether it's the move to clean power that other colleagues in the department are driving, which our view is decoupling and breaking our reliance from fossil fuel will be the key thing that helps us get bills down, because at the moment wholesale costs are the things that are driving bills up. But that sits alongside upgrading people's homes so that we can make them warmer and cheaper to run. So we are putting everything into the objective of trying to not just deliver homes that are warm, but homes that are ultimately cheaper to run for consumers, because that's all that really matters. On smart meters, so look, there is no compulsion on any household to adopt a smart meter. The reason we think smart meters are good, and the arguments that we will be trying to make, and a lot of the marketing campaign and the things that energy suppliers are doing, is that from the perspective of a consumer, it means that you know how much energy you're using. One, it means things like back billing, all the things that we talked about at the start of this session are reduced. But critically, I want to get to a world where consumers aren't just takers of the system that doesn't really do very well by them. And as we move, for example, to a more flexible system with half-hourly rates, it means that you as a consumer can be like, well, I'm going to use my energy at this time because it's better for me. It means that actually we can get to a world which is where we want to with smart homes, where people can basically sell their energy back into the grid and get money. So we want empowered consumers, but to be empowered consumers, they've got to be smart consumers with smart homes, and that's the opportunity around smart meters. Now, do we need to get the rollout better? Absolutely. Any smart meter that doesn't work dents people's confidence and trust in it. So we will never impose it on people. We need to make sure that they're persuaded that this is good for them, and show the benefits in tangible ways, and that does mean benefits into your pocket, to be fair. And then when we aren't delivering the standard, we've got to make sure there is that guarantee. So some of the work that we're doing at the moment, thinking about smart meters and working with industry, is what's the standard that consumers can expect, that they are aware of, and then how do we make sure that there are clear incentives and sanctions if those standards aren't met, because otherwise your point about confidence is absolutely a thing. And then finally, just in terms of spray foam specifically, and I come back to the point I made, we've got to get to a world where every upgrade is a good upgrade, quite frankly, whether it's through a government scheme or not. And that's not the world we're in, and that's a function of a system that is dysfunctional, that we need to reform. So what we are trying to do in the sort of past 8 months, and to be fair, the government beforehand, is if you take something like spray foam, we've been working with the mortgage industry, including with MHCLG and the mortgage industry, to say there cannot just be a blanket presumption that just because someone has had spray foam, you don't give them a mortgage, because actually, if it's installed well, it's absolutely fine. So we've got that reassurance now from a lot of the mortgage providers. I think there's 1 or 2 that we're still working with in order to take away that genuine risk. And I'm getting lots of emails from colleagues who are writing on behalf of their constituents where this is a problem. So we've got to fix things like that and work with others in the system to do it. But ultimately, it's all about confidence and trust, as you say. And so we have to design the system up front so that consumers are at the heart, it's simple, it's fair, and when things go wrong, people are confident that there is redress. And that's not where we are now, but that is absolutely where we need to get to.
Thank you very much. This will be the last question, because the means of
and my last question. May I express my appreciation to the Minister for her constructive and full response. My last question is slightly off-piece, but the figures we've been given by the clerks in the committee show that almost all the people who are working in the industry, which we've been discussing this afternoon, are men. And I'm just going to ask the Minister whether what she is doing to try and introduce the caring sex into this.
Yes. Well, the energy sector is dominated by men, as I'm finding. So there is a big push, to be honest, across the sector. But we are particularly exercised by it as a department to try and get more women in. I think when I think about Warm Homes Plan, if we get that right, for example, that is jobs that we're creating in every part of the country. And so whether that's the work that we're doing with industry, whether that's the money that we're putting into training and grant schemes, whether that's the work that we're doing with local authorities, we've got to open it up. I was at Future Builders, which is a big kind of industry conference, and actually they were trying to bring in young students and female students in order to kind of just open this up. Because we definitely need diversity, but most importantly, there are jobs here. There are jobs that will be created, and we need to make sure those jobs are equally accessible to everyone.
Minister, thank you very much. My daughter hopes to be one of those workers.
Amazing. Strongly encourage it.
Indeed. Can I finish by thanking Jessica Skilbeck, Jane Walker, and Minister Miatta Fahnbulleh for your evidence this afternoon. Our session ends. Order.